Cleopatra. I mean, just say the name, right? You probably picture this legendary queen, this femme fatale whose love affairs brought down empires. But what if I told you that story, the one we all know, isn't the whole picture? In fact, it might just be the least interesting thing about her.
So, was she this master of seduction? Or was she something else entirely? A brilliant strategist who used her relationships as, well, a political tool? That's the big question we're going to dig into in this explainer.
I mean, listen to this stuff. This is what her Roman enemies were saying about her. It's this wild, scandalous image that somehow stuck around for more than 2,000 years. But let's call it what it was. Propaganda. A smear campaign, pure and simple, designed to take down a powerful foreign queen. So, okay, let's peel back those layers of myth.
Okay, so to get to the real Cleopatra, we're not starting in the bedroom. Nope, we're starting in the library, because her greatest weapon, it wasn't her looks, it was her brain.
And you can see the difference right here. It's pretty stark. You know, Hollywood, all the myths, they're all about her being this fatal beauty. But the actual historical sources, they tell a completely different story. They barely even talk about what she looked like. What they do go on and on about is her incredible mind. Just let that sink in for a second. The people who were actually around back then, they weren't hung up on her looks. They were blown away by her charisma, her cleverness, and just how sharp and educated she was. 9. Just 9. That's how many languages she was fluent in. And here's the real kicker. She was the first ruler in her whole Greek-speaking dynasty to actually learn Egyptian. Think about that. This wasn't some party trick. It was a genius political move that let her talk directly to her own people. Remember, she grew up in Alexandria, which was basically the intellectual capital of the entire ancient world. So her education was intense. It covered everything a ruler would ever need to know. And her training in public speaking and debate, it meant she could walk into a room with the most powerful men on the planet and not just hold her own, but often completely dominate the conversation. So, with that powerful mind, let's talk about her famous relationships, right? Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Because when you stop looking at them as just love stories and start seeing them as strategy, well, a totally different picture starts to take shape.
Let's take her first meeting with Julius Caesar. This was no desperate plea for help. This was a high-stakes, all-or-nothing move. Okay, so picture this. She's in exile. Her brother's on the throne. What does she do? She gets herself rolled up in a rug and smuggled past all the guards right into Caesar's private rooms. I mean, talk about bold. It was incredibly risky, but it worked. Bam! Just like that, she's got the most powerful man in the world on her side.
And let's be clear, this alliance was basically a deal. It was a two-way street. Cleopatra needed Rome's military muscle to get her throne back. And Caesar? He desperately needed Egypt's money and, even more importantly, its grain, to keep his armies and the people of Rome fed. It wasn't about one person having all the power. It was a partnership built on what they both needed. Now, her partnership with Mark Antony, that was a whole other level. It lasted for a decade. When he called for her to meet him in Tarsus, she didn't show up like some subordinate. Oh no, she sails in on this incredible, magnificent barge dressed up as the goddess Isis. I mean, she completely flipped the script, the entire power dynamic. And their kids, they weren't just about love. They were the building blocks for a whole new empire. This was all about dynasty. It was all about power. But of course, this incredible alliance was a huge threat to Antony's main rival back in Rome, a guy named Octavian, who would later become Emperor Augustus. And Octavian, well, he had a weapon that was just as deadly as any army: propaganda. Just listen to this. I hate the queen. That's from Cicero, one of the most powerful senators in Rome. And that pretty much sums up how the Roman elite felt. They didn't see a respected fellow ruler. They saw a dangerous outsider, a threat to their power, a threat to everything they considered Roman. And this right here is where the myth we're all so familiar with really takes off. For Antony and his side, she was this divine partner, a goddess on earth. But for Octavian's propaganda machine, oh, she was a foreign witch, a seductress who'd put a spell on a good Roman general. He launched this absolutely brilliant and brutal character assassination that turned her into the boogeyman, everything Rome was afraid of. And it all came to a head at the Battle of Actium. This was so much more than just a naval battle. This was it, the final showdown between two completely different visions for the future of the world. You had Cleopatra and Antony on one side, fighting for their dream of a powerful Eastern empire, and on the other, you had Octavian,
who was dead set on becoming the one and only ruler of Rome. And, well, we know how it ended. Octavian's tactics and that non-stop propaganda, they won. So, after the big defeat, the story we usually hear is all about a tragic love affair ending in suicide. But let's look at it differently. Because even in her final moments, Cleopatra was still a strategist. She was still in control of her own story. Her suicide was not an act of a heartbroken lover. It was a calculated, political act. See, Octavian's plan was to drag her through the streets of Rome in chains, the ultimate public humiliation. By taking her own life, she made one last, incredible power move. She denied him his victory parade. She died on her terms, as a queen.
22 years. Let's not forget that. That's how long she ruled Egypt. And this was a tough time. She had to deal with civil wars, famines, and the constant crushing pressure from Rome. For over 2 decades, she kept her kingdom together and kept it independent. And during those years, her list of achievements is pretty amazing. She was a great administrator, she actually cared about her people, she pushed forward the arts and sciences, and she was a genius diplomat who managed to hold off the superpower of the day for as long as anyone possibly could. That's the legacy, the one that gets totally buried by the myth. So when you put it all together, this is the real Cleopatra. Not the seductress, a visionary leader. A brilliant woman whose mind was her greatest weapon in the incredibly high-stakes game of ancient politics. Which really just leaves us with one last big question. Why? Why, after 2,000 years, is the story of the lover a story, remember, written by her enemies, the one we all know, while the story of the leader gets forgotten? It's a question that maybe tells us just as much about ourselves and how we tell stories as it does about her.